They say that if you ever spoke to him, something inside you would quietly shift, as if a decision had been made without your permission. Before we go any further, write this simple sentence in the comments without thinking too much. I am ready to assume my end. Writing it is not symbolic. It is positional. Comments anchor attention. They create a shared field. They signal that you are not just listening, but participating. This channel exists because of that shared presence, and if this work supports your reflection and understanding, gentle support through Super Chat helps sustain and grow it naturally, without pressure, simply as resonance. He left behind no widely marked grave, no official archive, no public trail that historians could neatly follow. What remained were whispers, stories passed quietly between those who had crossed his path and never quite returned the same. His name was Abdullah, known simply as the Mystic, a man whose presence alone seemed to reorganize reality around him. He was not remembered for lectures or institutions, but for impact. Lives changed, not because he explained, but because he positioned. Harlem, early 1930s. The nights were cold, the streets carried the ache of the Great Depression, and jazz spilled from doorways like a heartbeat trying to survive the weight of the era. Yet, on West 137th Street stood a mansion that defied its surroundings. Large, dignified, filled with books, ritual objects, and an atmosphere that felt untouched by scarcity. For a black man in that time, its very existence was an anomaly. Inside, shelves bent under the weight of ancient Torah scrolls, mystical writings, and sacred texts. And at the center of it all was Abdullah, an Ethiopian Jewish rabbi who lived as though circumstances had already lost their authority. Those who entered that house did not come seeking information alone. Bankers, scholars, rabbis, artists, and members of the elite came because something happened there. They came because in Abdullah's presence, limitations stopped feeling absolute. He reportedly lived to an age exceeding a century, his longevity becoming part of his legend, not as spectacle, but as quiet evidence of mastery over inner life. People recalled that when he entered a room, nothing dramatic occurred, yet everything subtly recalibrated, as if reality took a step back and waited. Segregation shaped every corner of life. Theaters in New York were rigid symbols of exclusion, with front rows reserved for those society deemed worthy. One evening, during a highly anticipated Broadway performance, Abdullah walked calmly through the crowd, wrapped in his turban, unhurried, unreactive. He approached the ticket counter and asked simply for 2 front-row seats. There was no argument, no confrontation. Something shifted. The tickets were handed to him without charge. He took his place at the front, not as a rebel, but as a man who did not recognize boundaries others accepted as real. To him, sovereignty belonged to consciousness, not circumstance. It was into this world that Neville Goddard arrived, young, uncertain, a dancer from Barbados, struggling through the cold of New York. He confessed his longing to go home, admitting he had no money, no ticket, no visible means. Abdullah listened and replied without hesitation. "You are in Barbados," Neville protested, pointing to the obvious facts. Abdullah was unmoved. "Tonight," he said, "do not sleep in New York. Sleep in Barbados. Feel the salt air. Hear the ocean. Fall asleep there, and the world will rearrange itself." Night after night, Neville followed the instruction. He did not visualize as hope. He inhabited as fact. Weeks passed and doubt crept in. No ticket arrived. Anxiety surfaced. He pleaded again. Abdullah responded the same way. "Who told you that you are going to Barbados? You are already there." The door closed, not in rejection, but in initiation. You do not negotiate with reality. You assume the end and refuse contradiction. Then the letter arrived. Passage and money enclosed. A third-class ticket. Neville rushed to share the news. Abdullah corrected him instantly. "You went first class. You are in Barbados." The door closed again. On the day of departure, due to a cancellation, Neville was upgraded to first class. Standing on the deck, salt wind on his face, he realized something fundamental had shifted. This was not chance. This was alignment. This was the law of assumption lived, not discussed. By candlelight on another evening, Abdullah traced 2 Hebrew letters. Aleph, the spark, the beginning. Tav, the seal, the end. Together they formed the totality of creation. Everything that will ever appear already exists in completion. Creation does not start at the beginning, he taught. It starts at the end. If you want to create, begin where it is finished. Live there. Let the beginning arrange itself. He offered a metaphor that stayed with his students for life. Imagine watching a suspense film when you already know the ending. The audience panics at every turn, but you remain calm. You know how it resolves. This is how you live your desires, he said. Already at the end, untouched by appearances. When you live from that position, the world bends. When asked how this works, Abdullah dismissed the question. Do you understand electricity when you turn on a light? Of course not. Yet you flip the switch and the room illuminates. Stop asking how. Assume the end. Flick the switch. Joseph Murphy, later a celebrated writer and scholar, also studied with Abdullah. When Abdullah told him he was one of 6 children, Murphy disagreed, insisting there were only 5. Later he discovered a sibling who had died at birth. Abdullah did not guess. He perceived from a level untouched by surface facts. His greatest teaching was simple and uncompromising. There is no power outside the arrangement of your own mind. Neville would later echo this truth. Believe in your imagination, for the I am spoken of in Scripture is not distant. It is you. Tonight, write your desire not as a wish, but as a memory already lived. Close your eyes. Inhale the beginning. Exhale the end. Feel it complete. Sleep in that state. Tomorrow walk as though the outcome is settled. Do not wait for proof. Proof follows position. Abdullah lived quietly, left no monuments, and yet ignited something enduring in those willing to assume their end. Live from completion, and watch the world reorganize itself around that certainty. What most people never understood about Abdullah was that he was not trying to impress, persuade, or convince. He had no interest in building followers or leaving behind a system that could be packaged and sold. His teaching was positional, not instructional. Once the position was taken, there was nothing left to say. This is why so many accounts of him feel fragmented, almost unfinished. He did not give people something to hold on to. He removed the need to hold on to anything at all. Those who stayed around him long enough noticed a pattern. Abdullah never reacted to circumstances the way others did. News did not excite him. Problems did not disturb him. Praise did not inflate him. Criticism did not diminish him. It was as if events arrived already resolved in his awareness. This was not indifference. It was familiarity. He lived from the end of everything he encountered. Because of that, nothing appeared urgent or threatening. Life unfolded as confirmation, not surprise. Neville would later say that the most difficult part of learning from Abdullah was not imagining the desired outcome, but refusing to descend from it. The mind is conditioned to check reality constantly, to negotiate, to adjust expectations based on appearances. Abdullah rejected that habit entirely. To him, checking was betrayal. If you truly lived in the end, there was nothing to verify. Verification belonged to those who were still undecided. When Neville complained of hunger during those early years, Abdullah would cook meals and refuse to share them, not out of cruelty, but precision. You cannot eat in New York if you are sleeping in Barbados. To the rational mind, this sounded harsh. To Abdullah, it was consistency. You cannot occupy 2 states at once. You are either in the end or you are not. Compassion, in his teaching, was alignment, not comfort. This uncompromising stance forced Neville to confront something deeper than belief. It forced him to confront identity. Who are you when no one agrees with you? Who are you when circumstances contradict you? Who are you when there is no evidence to lean on? Abdullah knew that imagination only becomes creative when it is inhabited as self, not visited as exercise. Many visitors described leaving his house feeling unsettled at first, not inspired in the usual sense, but disoriented. The familiar inner dialogue had been interrupted. The constant commentary about lack, delay, and effort had nowhere to land. In its place was a strange quiet, almost uncomfortable, because it offered no excuses. In that silence, responsibility returned to its rightful place, not as burden, but as power. Abdullah often reminded his students that the world is always responding, never initiating. It mirrors the state you occupy, not the words you speak. This is why he placed such emphasis on sleep. Sleep was the doorway through which the conscious mind released control. What you carried into sleep became law, because resistance softened there. To sleep in the end was to surrender without collapse. Neville later expanded this teaching, but its core never changed. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and persist. What people often miss is the word persist does not mean effort. It means remain. Remain when nothing seems to move. Remain when doubt whispers. Remain when logic protests. Abdullah embodied this remaining so completely that those around him began to sense its inevitability. There are stories of people who tested him, who tried to provoke a reaction, to see if his composure would crack. It never did. He did not defend his position because it was not a position in debate. It was a state. States do not argue. They express. This is why Abdullah left no grave marked for pilgrims, no institution to preserve his name. His work was never about memory. It was about transmission. If you understood him, you did not need to remember him. You carried the position forward yourself. And this is the quiet challenge embedded in his teaching. If imagination truly creates reality, then waiting is a confession of disbelief. Hoping is an admission of distance. Only assuming closes the gap. Only living from the end dissolves time. Tonight, as you return to stillness, notice where you place yourself internally. Not what you want, but who you are being. Are you still watching the suspense, reacting to every twist? Or have you already seen the ending and settled into calm certainty? The world will follow whichever position you choose to occupy. Abdullah understood something that most spiritual discussions never touched directly, something too uncomfortable for systems built on reassurance. He understood that consciousness does not respond to effort. It responds to placement. Where you place yourself internally is not a preference. It is a command. And most people, without realizing it, spend their lives issuing contradictory commands, wanting one outcome while emotionally living inside another. To Abdullah, this was not a moral failure. It was simply ignorance of position. This is why he rarely corrected people gently. Gentleness would have implied negotiation. He was not interested in soft transitions between states. He wanted decisiveness. When Neville said, "I want to go to Barbados," Abdullah heard indecision. Wanting meant not being. Wanting meant distance. Wanting meant postponement. Abdullah replaced wanting with identity. You are in Barbados. The sentence leaves no room for process. Either you accept it or you don't. And if you don't, nothing further can be done. Most minds rebel at this point. They argue that such certainty is unrealistic, irresponsible, even delusional. Abdullah was unmoved by these objections because he understood their origin. They came from a consciousness trained to survive rather than to create. Survival consciousness reacts. Creative consciousness assumes. One waits for permission. The other gives it. Those who stayed near him long enough began to notice that Abdullah never described the future. He spoke only from completion. He did not say things will work out. He spoke as though they already had. This subtle difference is everything. The future tense keeps the mind oriented toward absence. Completion collapses time. When time collapses, causation rearranges itself without friction. This is also why so many people misunderstood the law of assumption when Neville later taught it. They treated it as a technique, something to be applied intermittently, something to test. Abdullah never tested. Testing implies uncertainty. If you test a bridge before crossing, you are still not across. Abdullah crossed internally and allowed the bridge to appear behind him. The world Neville described after meeting Abdullah was not a world without challenges. It was a world without intimidation. Circumstances still moved, delays still appeared, but they no longer carried authority. Authority had shifted inward. Once that shift occurs, events lose their power to define you. They become rearrangements, not verdicts. Abdullah often said that the greatest illusion people suffer under is the belief that conditions precede consciousness. He reversed this completely. Consciousness precedes and conditions follow. Not immediately, not theatrically, but inevitably. Inevitability was his language. He did not promise speed. He promised alignment, and alignment always resolves. This is why he emphasized the end rather than the path. Paths are variable. Ends are fixed. When you identify with the end, paths compete to fulfill it. When you identify with the path, the end remains optional. Abdullah refused optional outcomes. He taught finality. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. A person says they want stability, but internally they live as someone bracing for collapse. Another says they want love, but internally they live as someone anticipating loss. A third wants abundance, but internally rehearses scarcity. Abdullah would say the words are irrelevant. Reality responds to rehearsal, not to declarations. He would often ask his students to notice the inner posture they returned to when nothing demanded their attention. Not the moments of motivation, but the default. That default was the state they were actually living from. Everything else was decoration. Sleep was sacred to him for this reason. Sleep stripped away performance. It revealed where you truly resided. Whatever you fell asleep as, you awoke reinforced. Over time, this reinforcement hardened into fact. This is why he insisted Neville sleep in Barbados. Not think about it, not visualize it briefly, but inhabit it long enough for the body to accept it as normal. Normality is the hidden key. What feels normal does not require justification. What feels normal does not trigger resistance. What feels normal expresses itself quietly, persistently. Abdullah knew that the subconscious does not respond to intensity. It responds to familiarity. This is why excitement fades but assumption stabilizes. Many students failed at first because they tried to feel extraordinary. They tried to feel powerful. Abdullah corrected them. Power was not emotional. Power was settledness, the calm of someone who already knows, the quiet of someone who does not need signs. This calm was often mistaken for arrogance by outsiders. In truth, it was detachment from persuasion. Abdullah did not need agreement. Agreement belonged to debate. States do not debate. They are. Over time, Neville realized that what Abdullah had transmitted was not a philosophy, but a relocation of identity. He had been moved from observer to source, from responder to initiator, from hope to knowing. This relocation was irreversible. Once seen, it could not be unseen. This is why Abdullah left no school behind. Schools teach methods. He altered orientation. Once your orientation shifts, methods become unnecessary. You no longer ask what to do. You ask where you are being from. This teaching is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. If the end is assumed, waiting becomes illogical. If the end is assumed, complaining becomes incoherent. If the end is assumed, fear has no narrative to sustain itself. Fear depends on uncertainty. Certainty starves it. Abdullah did not deny emotion. He denied its authority. Emotions were weather. States were climate. Weather changes. Climate governs. He lived from climate. When people asked him why some assumptions take longer than others, he would often smile and say nothing. The answer was implied. You return to what feels like home. If the end does not feel like home yet, you will wander. Wandering is not punishment. It is practice. Neville later softened the language for broader audiences, but he never diluted the principle. The law of assumption does not work sometimes. It is always working. The only variable is where you are assuming from. This is the part most people avoid confronting. They want results without relocation. They want change without disidentification from the old self. Abdullah would have none of this. To him, creation required death, not physical death, but the death of the former position. You could not carry yesterday's identity into tomorrow's fulfillment. This is why his presence was unsettling. People sensed they were being asked to let go of who they had been, not gradually, but decisively. Many were not ready, those who were changed permanently. Abdullah's legacy survives not in texts, but in those moments when you stop asking if something is possible and start asking who you are being when you imagine it. In those moments, the teaching activates again, without his name, without ceremony. Now notice your own inner posture as you read this. Not what you want to change, but what you quietly accept as inevitable. That inevitability is your true assumption. If you want a different life, you do not need more effort. You need a different inevitability. This is the invitation Abdullah offered without softening. Choose the end. Live there. Refuse contradiction. Let appearances exhaust themselves trying to catch up. What makes this teaching difficult to integrate is not its complexity, but its simplicity. The mind trained by years of conditioning keeps searching for a missing step, a safeguard, a condition that makes the assumption reasonable. Abdullah removed reason from the process entirely. Reason belongs to a world that already exists. Creation belongs to the world before reasons appear. This is why he spoke from certainty rather than explanation. Explanations reassure the intellect. Certainty reorganizes experience. People often misunderstand living in the end as pretending. Abdullah would have rejected that immediately. Pretending implies awareness of falseness. Living in the end means inhabiting a state so fully that the question of truth no longer arises. You do not pretend to be yourself. You are yourself. In the same way, when the end is assumed, it is not acted. It is occupied. This occupation changes how perception works. Events are no longer interpreted as signs for or against you. They become neutral movements, temporary rearrangements on their way to resolution. This is why those who practiced Abdullah's teaching deeply reported a reduction in anxiety long before external changes occurred. Anxiety feeds on interpretation. When interpretation loses urgency, anxiety dissolves. Abdullah often allowed silence to do most of the teaching. Students expected commentary. He gave pauses. In those pauses, the mind confronted its own restlessness, the need to ask another question, to clarify, to adjust. He would wait until that need exhausted itself. Only then would a simple statement land. You are already there. Nothing more. This is also why many people today struggle when approaching Neville's work. They try to use the law while secretly preserving an escape hatch. If this doesn't work, then... Abdullah allowed no, then. The end was not conditional. It was final. Finality is frightening to a mind that equates control with safety. In truth, finality is freedom. Once the end is settled, there is nothing left to manage. Notice how much of daily mental activity is management. Managing expectations, managing impressions, managing outcomes. This constant management reinforces the belief that reality is fragile. Abdullah lived as though reality was robust, responsive, and obedient to inner placement. Because of that, he had no need to manage it. This is the deeper meaning behind his apparent indifference to social boundaries. It was not that he denied their existence historically. It was that he denied their authority internally. Authority accepted internally becomes law externally. Authority rejected internally dissolves over time, even if slowly. He did not rush that dissolution. He trusted it. The Barbados story is often told as a miracle of manifestation. In truth, it is a story about non-retreat. Neville's success did not come from imagining well. It came from refusing to relocate back into doubt when nothing seemed to move. The refusal was the act. Everything else followed. Most people imagine the end briefly, then return to commentary. Abdullah never returned. That was the difference. Commentary recreates the old state. Silence sustains the new one. Silence is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of negotiation. This is why Abdullah discouraged discussion of obstacles. Obstacles only exist relative to a path. When you live from the end, paths are irrelevant. Whatever appears becomes part of the route automatically. When you identify with the end, even resistance reorganizes itself into assistance. This does not happen magically. It happens logically, but from a logic deeper than conscious reasoning. Another subtle point often missed is that Abdullah did not teach people to escape effort. He taught them to remove effort from identity. Actions still occurred. Choices were still made, but they arose from alignment rather than urgency. Urgency compresses the mind. Alignment relaxes it. Relaxation allows clarity. Clarity produces efficient action without strain. This is why those who lived from assumption often reported acting differently without planning to. Conversations changed tone. Decisions felt obvious. Opportunities appeared ordinary rather than miraculous. This ordinariness is important. The law expresses itself quietly when it is accepted fully. Drama belongs to resistance. Abdullah's longevity was not incidental to his teaching. A mind not constantly bracing itself conserves enormous energy. Most fatigue is psychological, not physical. It comes from internal contradiction. Wanting one thing while living as another drains the system. Assumption resolves contradiction. Resolution restores energy. He once remarked that people age faster when they carry unresolved futures inside them. Fear of what might happen is a constant tension. Living from the end removes that tension. The future is no longer a threat. It is already known. When the future stops attacking the present, the body relaxes. This is why his students often felt calm even in uncertainty. Uncertainty existed externally, but internally the outcome was settled. This internal settlement is what most people mistakenly wait to feel after success arrives. Abdullah reversed the order. Feel settled first. Let success follow. At no point did he promise ease of transition. The collapse of the old identity can feel disorienting. Familiar patterns protest when they lose relevance. Doubt makes noise when it senses it is being starved. Abdullah did not interpret this noise as failure. He interpreted it as withdrawal symptoms from a state no longer being fed. If you experience discomfort while assuming the end, it does not mean you are doing it wrong. It means the former position is dissolving. Comfort returns when the new state becomes familiar. Familiarity is built through remaining, not through effort. This is why persistence, in its true sense, is gentle. It is not forceful repetition. It is quiet refusal to relocate. You do not argue with doubt. You outgrow it. You do not fight appearances. You let them pass. Abdullah's teaching, stripped of mystique, asks a single question repeatedly. Where are you living from right now? Not what do you want, not what are you hoping for, but what is your current residence of being? That residence determines what feels possible, what feels likely, and what feels inevitable. Inevitability is the true creative force. Whatever you experience as inevitable organizes itself efficiently. Whatever you experience as uncertain stalls. The world mirrors this precisely, without judgment. This is why the teaching does not need belief. Belief is unstable. Belief argues with disbelief. Assumption bypasses belief entirely. You assume many things daily without believing in them consciously. You assume the floor will hold you. You assume language will function. You assume tomorrow will arrive. These assumptions shape experience effortlessly. Abdullah simply redirected that natural mechanism toward conscious creation. He did not add anything new. He removed misdirection. Now pause for a moment and notice what you silently assume about your own life. Not what you say publicly, but what you expect privately. That expectation is not a thought. It is a posture. It is how you stand inside your own mind. Change the posture, and time reorganizes. Change the posture, and causation follows. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is structural reality. Abdullah never asked anyone to worship imagination. He asked them to trust it. Trust does not require intensity. It requires consistency. When trust becomes stable, reality responds as if receiving clear instructions for the first time. And so the teaching remains simple, uncomfortable, and complete. Choose the end. Live there. Let the beginning arrange itself. Refuse to move back. Everything else is commentary. There is a subtle moment that arrives for anyone who truly applies this teaching, and it is rarely talked about because it feels almost anticlimactic. It is the moment when you realize you no longer need to think about the desire at all. The desire dissolves, not because it failed, but because it has been absorbed into identity. Abdullah understood this moment deeply. To him, desire was a signal of separation. Fulfillment was silence. Most people cling to desire because it gives direction. Abdullah removed direction by removing distance. When the end is assumed, direction collapses. You are no longer moving toward something. You are moving from something. This shift changes the entire psychological economy of a person. Effort stops being emotional. It becomes mechanical, neutral, efficient. This is why people who lived from the end often appeared strangely relaxed even when working intensely. Their nervous systems were not tied to outcome. Outcome was already settled internally. Work became expression rather than compensation. Abdullah lived this way. He did not hustle for confirmation. He allowed confirmation to find him. One of the most misunderstood aspects of his teaching is the role of contradiction. People believe they must eliminate contradictory thoughts. Abdullah never taught this. He taught irrelevance. Contradictory thoughts lose power when they are no longer consulted. A thought that is not consulted cannot command action. It becomes background noise. Silence is not achieved by force. It emerges when attention relocates. Attention was sacred to him. He treated it as the most valuable currency a human being possesses. Where attention rests consistently, reality consolidates. This is why he discouraged constant checking of circumstances. Checking is attention leakage. It reinforces the assumption that the end is uncertain. Uncertainty fed regularly becomes structure. Many students failed not because they imagined poorly, but because they kept returning attention to the middle. The middle is unstable. The middle contains no authority. The middle invites anxiety because it has no conclusion. Abdullah refused the middle. He lived from conclusion only. This also explains his apparent disregard for time. Time only matters when you are on the way. When you are already there, time loses relevance. Events still unfold sequentially, but psychologically, you are finished. This finishing creates patience without passivity. You move when movement is required. You wait without suffering when waiting occurs. Neville later articulated this as Sabbath, the state of rest after creation. Sabbath is not inactivity. It is the absence of internal struggle. Abdullah lived in perpetual Sabbath. From that place, action arose cleanly. People sometimes ask why the law appears to work inconsistently. Abdullah would say it never works inconsistently. Consciousness does. The law mirrors the dominant position, not the occasional intention. This is uncomfortable because it removes the fantasy of partial responsibility. You cannot claim the result you like and disown the ones you don't. Both arise from the same source. This realization often triggers resistance. The ego prefers complexity because complexity allows delay. Simplicity demands honesty. Abdullah's simplicity was surgical. He cut through excuses without attacking the person. He attacked positions, not personalities. This is why his teaching feels confrontational even decades later. It asks you to locate yourself honestly, not where you wish you were, not where you fear you might be, but where you consistently return. That return point is home, and home governs. Abdullah did not moralize about good or bad assumptions. He treated them all as creative. Fearful assumptions create efficiently. Confident assumptions create efficiently. The mechanism is neutral. The question is not whether you are assuming. You always are. The question is what? This neutrality is liberating. It means there is nothing wrong with you. There is only position. Positions can be changed instantly, but familiarity resists. Familiarity is the only inertia. This is why repetition matters, not as discipline, but as acclimation. You acclimate to a new end until it feels ordinary. Ordinary is the final test. When the end feels ordinary, it is done. If it still feels exciting, threatening, or fragile, it is not yet assumed. Abdullah waited for ordinariness. He knew that what feels ordinary does not trigger correction. It expresses itself naturally. This is also why many manifestations arrive quietly. No fireworks, no dramatic pivot. They arrive as if they had always been on their way. People say it happened suddenly, but internally it had been settled long before. Abdullah often said that the world does not need to be convinced. It needs to be informed. Consciousness informs through state, not speech. You inform reality by who you are being when no one is watching. This is why private moments matter more than public affirmations. Who are you when the day ends? Who are you when the room is silent? Who are you when no outcome is demanded? That is the state you are training. Training is not force, it is return. Every return strengthens the state. This is why failure does not exist in this teaching. There is only return or drift. Drift is not punishment. It is information. Abdullah did not shame drift. He simply refused to validate it. Validation feeds states. Ignoring starves them. He starved doubt by refusing to acknowledge it as meaningful. This refusal was not denial of experience. It was denial of authority. Experiences happen. Authority is assigned. Abdullah assigned authority only to the end. His students learned that the fastest way to change an outcome was not to fix the problem, but to withdraw belief from the problem's permanence. Permanence is always assumed, never inherent. Remove the assumption, and the structure dissolves over time. Time is the ally of assumption. What you consistently assume, time amplifies. This is why panic is counterproductive. Panic is a confession that time is working against you. Abdullah lived as though time was already aligned. Because of that, it was. When people ask how long they should persist, the question reveals the misunderstanding. Persistence is not a task. It is a residence. You do not persist in your home. You live there. This is why the law cannot be gamed. It responds to sincerity, not strategy. Strategy belongs to manipulation. Sincerity belongs to identity. Abdullah dealt only in identity. Identity is the deepest lever of reality. Change identity and behavior, perception, opportunity, and interaction reorganize automatically. No force required, no affirmation needed. Identity speaks louder than words. Abdullah's teaching remains alive because it bypasses culture, language, and era. It does not depend on belief systems. It depends on awareness. Awareness is universal. As you sit with this, notice whether you are trying to apply it or whether you are allowing it to reposition you. Application keeps you outside. Repositioning brings you in. There is nothing to add, nothing to perfect, nothing to wait for. Choose the end. Live there quietly. Let the world exhaust itself trying to prove you wrong. In time, it will stop trying and start agreeing. What ultimately distinguishes Abdullah's teaching from every diluted version that followed is that he never promised improvement, only relocation. Improvement implies staying who you are and polishing the surface. Relocation implies leaving a position entirely. He was not interested in making people better versions of themselves. He was interested in moving them into a different center of gravity. Once that shift occurred, improvement happened on its own, without effort, without self-surveillance. This is why his influence feels timeless. Techniques age, language evolves, cultural metaphors fade, but position remains. A state assumed today operates the same way it did in Harlem in the 1930s. Reality still arranges itself around identity. Time still obeys inner placement. Circumstances still echo what is lived internally, not what is requested verbally. Abdullah did not teach hope because hope still looks forward. He taught completion. Completion ends seeking. Seeking keeps the door open for contradiction. Completion closes it gently, without force. When the door is closed, noise eventually stops knocking. Many people spend their lives oscillating between desire and disappointment because they never fully leave the threshold. They stand between wanting and being, mistaking motion for progress. Abdullah removed the threshold. You are either in or you are out. Either you live from the end or you observe it from a distance. Observation does not create. Occupation does. This is why his teaching can feel severe to those accustomed to encouragement. Encouragement implies lack. He assumed capacity. He assumed authority. He assumed that the one listening was already powerful enough to choose a state and remain there. His firmness was respect, not hardness. He did not lower the bar to meet insecurity. He invited insecurity to dissolve by refusing to acknowledge it. Neville carried this transmission forward in words, lectures, and books. But he never claimed authorship of the principle. He knew where it came from. He knew it was not his. It was discovered through experience, through correction, through refusal to compromise with appearances. The Barbados story was not a miracle. It was a demonstration of fidelity to position. This fidelity is the quiet discipline at the heart of the law of assumption. Not repetition, not visualization schedules, not emotional highs. Fidelity. Remaining loyal to the end even when nothing outside confirms it, especially then, because confirmation is not the cause, it is the echo. If you take nothing else from Abdullah's teaching, take this. Reality does not need to be persuaded, it needs to be informed. And it is informed not by what you say, but by where you stand when you say nothing. Your inner residence speaks constantly. The world listens without judgment. There is no final ritual to perform. No affirmation to memorize, no symbol to worship. The work is finished the moment you stop relocating back into doubt. From that moment on, life becomes correspondence. Events arrive not as surprises, but as confirmations. Abdullah left no grave because his work was never meant to be remembered as history. It was meant to be enacted. Each time someone chooses the end over the explanation, the teaching lives again, quietly, effectively, without ceremony. Now the question returns to you, not as instruction, but as recognition. Where are you living from right now? Not temporarily, not aspirationally, but habitually. That place is shaping everything. Choose deliberately. Remain gently. Let the world catch up. This is the law he lived. This is the law he transmitted. And it remains exactly as powerful now as it was then.